what is the correct canon of Scripture? And particularly when we think about the Old Testament, is the Apocrypha, as they are so called in some cases, are they to be included? Is the Apocrypha a part of the Scriptures? This is a question that has been debated between Protestants, Reformed, and on the one hand, and Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholics on the other for some time. And when we think about this question, there are two lines of argumentation that can be given. There's the biblical evidence, and then there is the historical evidence. The point of this video will be to focus on the historical evidence, but before we get there, I do want to point out some of the biblical evidence. The reason for focusing particularly on the historical side of things for this video is because, in general, the position of Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox that they say is that we are upholding the position of the early church. And when when the Protestants came along in the 16th century, they were actually removing books that the church had always received. That is the narrative that is given, the historical narrative, and that's what I want to push back on here. But just in terms of the biblical evidence, it's important to note that there is actually, amazingly, in the New Testament, a direct testimony as to the canon of Scripture in the Old Testament. This is what Christ gives in Luke 24, verse 44. When he speaks, he's speaking to his disciples, and he's going to open their minds to understand the Scriptures, all the things that are written concerning him. And he says this, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." The law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. So there's this threefold group of books that Christ is referring to. And if you know anything about the way in which the Jews, even to this day, will describe the Hebrew Bible, you'll note that this threefold description corresponds exactly to the way in which they describe their Hebrew Bible. So it is the Tanakh, that is the Torah, the Naviim, and the Ketuvim. And the Torah is the law of Moses, and then the Naviim is the prophets, and then the Ketuvim is the writings, the biggest book of which kind of summarizes the whole, is the Psalms. And so from a very early stage, you had this threefold description was a way to refer to a certain group of books: the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, or the law, the prophets, and the writings. And this was a known canon. This was a known set of books, and it did not include the Apocrypha. And therefore, we have actually in the New Testament a direct testimony that is borne by Christ himself as to what is the authoritative Scriptures. Furthermore, other evidence that can be given biblically is the fact that the Apocrypha is essentially never cited. There really is only, to my knowledge, only one allusion to Second Maccabees in Hebrews chapter 11. It's a very light allusion. It's basically just a recognition of a historical fact. So when we think about these books not being canonical, we're not saying that they are wrong about everything. So if they record a historical fact, it can be alluded to. But what this means then is that there's just as much citation of pagan literature as there is for the Apocrypha. Furthermore, there's just as much citations, and even more, you could say, of the pseudepigrapha than there is actually the Apocrypha. The pseudepigrapha would refer to those writings that are between the Testaments, that were Jewish writings, are written about various topics that nobody has ever considered to be canonical, and that are basically, they're basically not actually written by the people that they are purported to be written by. And so, for instance, in the book of Jude, there's a couple of citations, like, for instance, in the book of Enoch, there's a citation of the book of Enoch in the first book of Enoch in the book of Jude, and there's an allusion also to another pseudepigraphal work, but there is nothing even that explicit with regard to the Apocrypha in the New Testament at all. And so you could say there is a direct testimony from Christ, and then there's just the plain fact that the New Testament authors did not treat those books as canonical. They did not cite them as Scripture anywhere in the New Testament, in a document, the New Testament, which is filled with citations, hundreds, perhaps even thousands of citations of the Old Testament, and there is no clear citation of the Apocrypha. There is, again, to my knowledge at least, only one allusion in the book of Hebrews chapter 11. Now, that seems to be pretty clear, but then, the pushback is, well, what about the early church? Isn't it the case that the church has always received these books that are now called apocryphal by some? Haven't they always received these books? And yet, when you look at the testimony of the early church, and even all of church history, what you find is that the majority position, very clearly the majority position, is that the books were not considered canonical. I'm getting this information particularly from Archibald Alexander's book, The Canon of the Old and New Testaments Ascertained. He has a very great section on the historical evidence and gives the primary sources as well. So I encourage anyone who is interested to go take a look at that. Archibald Alexander was a 19th century Presbyterian theologian and has done just a great job of looking into this particular question. And he notes that the first catalog that we have from anyone with regard to the canon of the Old Testament is from a letter that is preserved by Eusebius. It's a 2nd century letter, and it's Melito to his brother Onesimus. And there he describes that the canon of the Old Testament. He says the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 4 books of Kings, 2 of Chronicles, the Psalms of David, the Proverbs of Solomon or Wisdom, Ecclesiastes, the Song of Songs, Job, Isaiah, Jeremiah, 12 prophets in 1 book, Daniel, Ezekiel, Ezra. Those exactly correspond to the Old Testament as we have it without the Apocrypha. Origen from the 3rd century also says that the Hebrews have given to us the scriptures, in the sense of, he actually takes what they have declared to be canon, to be what the church receives as canon as well. He numbers them 22, different from our 39, just because the book of the 12, the Minor Prophets, is considered 1 book. The Kings is not divided into 2, but 22 would have been the number that corresponds exactly in terms of content, to the 39 books as we currently divide them today. It would be without the Apocrypha. So you have Origen is also has this position. Athanasius also speaks directly to the canon and excludes the Apocrypha. Hilary, Gregory Nazianzen, Jerome very famously has even as he translated the Vulgate, did say that the other books are not on the same level of authority. Epiphanius from the 4th century as well, Cyril of Jerusalem as well. Furthermore, in the 4th century, there was a council that said the same thing. The Council of Laodicea, in again the mid-4th century, declared that the canon to be what it was. Chrysostom as well would fall into this position as well. So here you have, just if you know anything about church history and the fathers, these are not obscure people. These are major names, and if all of these names are agreeing, very clearly that is the majority position of the early church. And one of the things that Archibald Alexander actually says is that within the first 400 years, really the only major figure who appears to have a different view of the canon is Augustine. And Augustine got so many things right, but here he appears to have gotten this thing wrong. There are 2 councils then in North Africa that came in the late 4th century that reflect his view, so his view of the canon. And so there are councils that are contradictory to the Council of Laodicea in the mid-4th century. That seems to be the only stream where there is this acceptance of these books that are apocryphal. In terms of this time period. Now there would be some more that will come even shortly after, perhaps, but in these first 400 years, this appears to be the only ones. Interestingly, Archibald Alexander actually shows that there is some evidence that Augustine may have even changed his view. So it's hard to know one way or another, but one of the things that he says, for instance, in his commentary on Psalm 40 is, he says, if any adversary should say, you have forged these prophecies, let the Jewish books be produced. The Jews are our librarians, is what he says. So that would seem to indicate that there is a connection between the books that the Jews have given and the canon of Scripture. Psalm 56, when we wish to prove to the pagans that Christ was predicted, we appeal to the writings in possession of the Jews. They have all these Scriptures. So again, that seems to say, at least suggest, that there's this connection between what the Jews said was Scripture and what... and the canon that's received by the church. These Psalms, commentaries on Psalms, my understanding is that these were written after De Doctrina Christiana, which is where Augustine makes a statement in favor of the Apocrypha. There is even another work where, speaking of the book of the Maccabees, Augustine says, this writing the Jews never received in the same manner as the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, to which the Lord gave testimony as by his own witness. That's something that Augustine said. Now you'll notice here, in this quotation, even apart from what Augustine may say himself, you'll note here in this quotation that the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, Augustine is clearly recognizing that this is the same body of work, the same content, the same books as what the Jews have said even to this day, again, corresponding to the Tanakh and equal to our canon. And he's even recognizing that when Christ was using this threefold distinction, Moses, the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms, Christ was in fact referring to those set of books that do not include the Apocrypha. Now, as you go on into the Middle Ages, even then we see something very similar. Gregory the Great, others very significantly, one very, very significant in terms of Eastern Orthodox theology, John of Damascus, perhaps the greatest theologian of the Eastern Orthodox Church, had the same view of the canon as Protestants. On the Roman Catholic side, amazingly, two great medieval figures, Peter Lombard did not receive the Apocrypha as scripture, and Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas did not receive the Apocrypha as scripture. He had the same view of the canon as Protestants in the 13th century. One of the greatest theologians of Roman Catholicism did not believe that the Apocrypha was scripture. That is an amazing thing in and of itself historically. And yet we can say even more about the historical witness. And that is that it's not just him, but even we could say Cardinal Cajetan, who was so influential in the 16th century to argue against the Protestants. Before the Council of Trent, he did not receive the Apocrypha as scripture. Just to highlight this amazing thing, this is what he says as a Cardinal Cajetan. The Church is much indebted to this father, speaking of Jerome, for distinguishing between the books which are canonical and those which are not. For thus he has freed us from the reproach of the Hebrews, who otherwise might say that we had framed a new canon for ourselves. And then he says, concerning the apocryphal books, he wrote no commentaries on them. This is, again, Cardinal Cajetan. He says, for Judith, Tobit, Maccabees, Wisdom, and the additions to Esther are all excluded from the canon as insufficient to prove any matter of faith, though they may be read for the edifying of the people. Now, here is a 16th century Roman Catholic theologian who is devoted to arguing against the Protestants. And before the Council of Trent, he had the exact same view of the scripture in terms of its canon as the Protestants themselves. And the implication of all this is that it is actually the Council of Trent in the 16th century that clearly is innovating. That is to say, there is this view of Roman Catholicism that where was the Reformed faith? This Protestant faith in the first 16 centuries of the church, or the first 15 centuries of the church. It just is like it never existed. And then all of a sudden, boom, it's here, and that's used as an argument against it. And yet, you could say the same thing with regard to the canon of Scripture. Which side is actually upholding not just the position of the early church, but the consistent testimony of the church through every age? Not to say again that this is a universally held in terms of a unanimous decision, but it was in some sense universally held in the sense of this has always been the majority position for the first 15 centuries of the church. This was the majority position. Even again, those who hold to the Apocrypha, their greatest theologians, most influential theologians, John of Damascus on the Eastern Orthodox side, and Thomas Aquinas in the Western Roman Catholic side, held to the view of the canon that the Protestants have and had in the 16th century, upheld by a council, the Council of Laodicea, which canons were actually approved of in the Council of Chalcedon as well. So they upheld the canons of Laodicea, which included a declaration, an ecumenical council, included a declaration about the canon. And so for all of this, the implication is very clear that the church has always received, in terms of its majority position, has always received the canon of the 39 books of the Protestant Bible. It is what Christ himself has testified to. It is clearly the position of the New Testament writers, and it is very clearly the majority position of the church. It is the Reformed faith that has upheld this position of the Church against both Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. May it be, in light of this, that God would help you to see the wonder of His Word as it has been given, as Christ Himself has testified, and may it be that you would find life in it.